Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you at our Energize Your Classroom webinar series.
Good
And we're delighted that you can join us. Welcome. We're here with Chantelle. I'm going to introduce her in a moment. A lot of you already know her. She's done incredible trainings for us so far. But first of all, let me welcome you to another academic year here with Language Cert. We're delighted that you can join us in our webinar series. My name is Silvia Carastafi. For those of you who have not met me before in our webinars, I'm the head of teacher support for Language Cert, and I want to wish you a creative academic year, a successful academic year, lots of strength for the year ahead. And we are here at Language Cert to support you and also inspire you and energize you in that journey. And we're excited to announce this new edition of our Energize Your Classroom series. And this time we have a particular emphasis on the human touch. So here we have Energize Your Classroom with a human touch. And it is a 4-part webinar series that runs from September to December. And this is especially designed for teachers. And we want to introduce new perspectives. We want to introduce useful ideas to you that can support you in the beginning of the academic year, but also throughout the year. And this year's theme, you will see that we have different kinds of focus. We will focus here in our first webinar on the inner voice, on the power of the inner voice, and especially focusing on the young learner classroom. Later on in October, we'll look at the teenage classroom and we'll look at soft skills in the teenage classroom. And then in November, we will look at harnessing the power of the visual arts. And finally, in December, we will look at promoting empathetic communication. So all our speakers place very special emphasis on the human touch that teachers bring to their classrooms and an emphasis on the aspects of human communication. And today we have Chantelle that will talk to us about the power of the student's inner voice. Chantelle is a teacher trainer and a teacher, and she has wide range experience in a variety of contexts. For us, she's also a Language Cert interlocutor for all levels and a trainer. We work with Chantelle every year because she brings these values that we very much are passionate about here at Language Cert: the creativity, the sensitivity to the emotional life of the brain, as she calls it now, and it's her new interest. And also combining these ideas with practical insights that can be actionable in a classroom. So Chantelle, thank you so much for being here to open this webinar season.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you for the very warm welcome, because I'm coming to you from a very cold and rainy Italy today. Thanks for the warm welcome, the lovely words. So yeah, today we're going to talk about the young learner classroom, and in particular talking about the inner voice. So I'm going to start with 2 questions for you. And the first, and please feel free to write in the chat so we can communicate as we're going along. Do you ever talk to yourself? This is the first strange question I'm going to ask you today. Do you ever talk to yourself? Sure, some of you seem very happy about this. I'm not the only one. That's good. Okay, so you talk to yourself, and we all do. And so when we're talking about the inner voice today, we're talking about this idea of the conversations that we have in our heads. Okay. So I've tried to break it down to different areas and to make it very relatable to the classroom. As Sylvia said, I'm also a teacher, and so hopefully I'll be able to bring some of my own personal experience into the webinar today as we're talking. Okay, so we're going to start with this idea of connecting with ourselves. So we'll start with this idea of connecting with ourselves. So the second question I want to ask you is, would you like to time travel? Now, this is one of my favorite questions to ask my students, especially when I'm doing things like the second conditional. And the follow-up question is usually, would you like to go to the past? Would you like to go to the future? And it's always a great conversation starter with students. And I see some of you ask your students the same thing. But what if I told you that actually we time travel every day with our minds, with our inner voice? We're constantly going between the past and the future. Sometimes we can spend quite a lot of our time reminiscing on the past or worrying, feeling a little bit anxious about the future. And the chatter that goes on in our brain with our inner voice is at an incredible speed of about 4,000 words a minute. And I remember when I read that, I kind of thought that's impossible because it's basically the length of a presidential speech. And so we have a huge amount of chatter that goes on in our brain on a daily basis. And so the question is sort of, do these thoughts control us, or do we control what we're thinking about? And another question is, what does it feel like to be in your head? And I know some of you might think, don't even go there. But these are just some questions to reflect on as we're going forward. So very briefly, because there would be a lot to say about this, when we talk about the inner voice is very much connected to our working memory, which is the inner ear. So for example, if I said a telephone number to you and you were trying to remember it, you would say that to yourself. And that's pretty much the inner voice in a very, very simplistic way. We know that our verbal development goes hand in hand with our emotional development. And this is why we talk about emotion so much when we're talking about teaching and learning language. We also know that how we view the world is very, very influenced by the environments that we inhabit. For example, if you look at the little picture there, we have a little child sort of saying, hey, you can do it. So if you've grown up in an environment, a home environment, a school environment where you've been given that message, then that becomes part of your verbal stream. So that in maybe times of difficulty, times of struggle, somehow that inner voice tells you, you can do it. It's somehow been programmed into your brain. And so in a certain sense, we sort of use our minds, and I like this line, to write the stories of our lives. And we're sort of the main character. So we sort of create our own realities in a certain sense. So this inner voice is always with us, always influencing us as we go through our daily lives. So when we talk about the inner voice, sometimes this is referred to as sort of chatter, this sort of chatting that goes on in our minds. And paying attention and being aware of this chatter is actually very important for our mental health, because it has a huge impact on how we live our lives and how we interpret things that happen to us. So very often, what we feel and what we think about things is more important than what actually happens, how we interpret things. So what we think about situations is a better predictor of happiness than what we actually do. So we could win all of the money in the world, and this is something that happens to us. But if we think, well, it's not really going to change anything, it's not going to make me happy, then that thought is what's going to be more powerful. We also know that we can spend a huge amount of our times, the time of our day, thinking, as we said before in this chatter, thinking about the past, thinking about the future. And we have statistics that say it can be about 47%, which is about half of a person's day, which is a huge amount when you think about it. And we know that this constant chatter can also be connected to stress, because if we're living through a stressful experience, we know that our body has a certain reaction, a certain physical reaction. But even if we think about a stressful situation, we have the same reaction. Your body doesn't tend to differentiate between something that's happening really in that moment or something that you're just thinking or reminiscing on. Okay, so I want to give you an example, a practical example of this chatter. Imagine a day where you heard different things, different feedback being given to you, things like, I saw you really listening today, thank you. Or you look great today. Or I love how you helped your friend when he was having problems in class. Sometimes we say things like this to our students. Or your homework exercises were really good. I can see you really studied. And all of these things obviously give us a positive sense of self. But then maybe we also hear something like, I can't believe you've made another stupid mistake. Now, my question to you is, if you heard all of these comments in one day, which is the comment that you would perhaps spend more time thinking about? I think we can agree that unfortunately the mind is always looking for problems, and probably this negative one, I can't believe you've made another stupid mistake. This is the one that can go over and over in our minds again and again. And sometimes we can actually completely lose perspective, and it limits our ability to see the bigger picture because of the emphasis that our chatter can have focusing on this negative comment that we've heard. To give you another example, I don't know, have you ever tried to read a book after fighting with someone? It's impossible because your mind is not focused. You're not mindful on what you're actually doing, but you're going over and over again in your mind something that's happened before. And we call this paralysis by analysis, that we almost become paralyzed because we keep thinking about something, and we're kind of stoking the fires of keeping these negative feelings alive. And another negative aspect of this is that sometimes we can also displace our aggression because maybe we're getting quite annoyed or quite anxious about these negative thoughts that are in our minds, and we can end up perhaps having an argument with somebody over something silly because we're focused on what's happened before. Okay, so this is just to kind of give you an idea of this chatter. Okay, so we need to understand, because we're here today as teachers, and we very much appreciate you being here from your very busy schedules in September on a Wednesday afternoon. So we have to think, okay, so how could this be possibly related to our teaching and our students in the classroom? Well, first of all, as we said, we all have an inner voice. We all have thoughts that are going around in our heads, but children are particularly vulnerable. And the way we talk to our children becomes their inner voice. And I think if you're young learner teachers, we've all had the experience of when you say positive things to children, when you give them positive feedback, their whole face lights up. Words, expressions like, you're so kind and helpful, you can do hard things, mistakes happen, it's okay, because we know young learners can get very upset when they make mistakes. Your feelings are important. I love how you see the world. It's a different point of view. I believe you can do it. These are all very, very important words, phrases, expressions that can really build up children and make them feel that they can face, especially if we're talking about the language classroom, where people can feel very, very vulnerable, because it's a scary thing, isn't it, to have to speak in another language that isn't your own. So I want to continue with telling you a story of a little girl, and some of you might recognize her. Once upon a time, there was a little girl called Matilda, and Matilda was about 6 years old, and she was a very, very special little girl, actually. Matilda was very, very smart, very intelligent, and very, very curious. But Matilda was very different from the rest of her family, because while she was very kind and caring, her family were quite cruel and quite neglectful. And they didn't really recognize her great intelligence, and they didn't really show any interest in her. So it wasn't very easy for Matilda to live in this family. So what was Matilda's escape? Her escape were books. She loved reading. She loved escaping to other worlds. By the age of 4, she was already reading Charles Dickens, which is very, very impressive. And some of you are maybe connecting the dots, and maybe you recognize this story. It's a story of Matilda by Roald Dahl. I don't know, you can tell me in the chat box if you're familiar with the children's author Roald Dahl, who was a favourite of mine when I was growing up. We would read a lot of Roald Dahl in the classroom. And a lovely part of the thinking behind Matilda is Matilda's strong young mind continued to grow, nurtured by the voices of all those authors who had sent their books out into the world like ships on the sea. These books gave Matilda a hopeful and comforting message. You're not alone. And so the voices she heard through these books gave her some sort of comfort. And some of you are writing here that it's your favourite story. He's a wonderful writer. He is. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the books of Roald Dahl, because they're quite important when we're talking about children and developing children's self-confidence and their inner voice. So going back to Matilda and her story. So Matilda goes to school, and you can imagine how excited and happy she was to go to school, to get out of the house where people didn't really understand her or care about her. And she loved reading, so she was really looking forward to going to a place of learning. But when she goes to the school, the first person she meets is the principal, who is Miss Trunchbull. And as you can see, sometimes we forget how enormous we look to children. As adults, we can seem like giants. But Miss Trunchbull was anyway quite a big lady and a little bit scary because she was a little bit of a bully. She was quite rude, quite insulting, and she didn't actually like children. So perhaps it wasn't really the best place for her to be in a school. And to give you an example, some of the school rules that she put in place were quite incredible. Things like no praying, no fun, no talking, no laughing, no whispering, no running in halls, no pigtails, no eating, no colouring, no playing. And maybe worst of all for children, no daydreaming. So you can imagine the type of school environment that she was trying to create. And just on a side note, I actually use Miss Trunchbull's school rules sometimes in a first lesson when I teach young learners. And that's not to say these are the rules that I give my young learners. But we look through them together to learn some verbs. And then we talk about whether they're fair, if they're good rules. Maybe some of the rules are acceptable, some of them aren't. And it's a great jumping off point to then create our own school rules for the classroom, because I think afterwards then asking the kids to be respectful, to put up their hand, to listen to each other, it doesn't really seem that bad once they've seen Miss Trunchbull's school rules. So this is one of the first people that Matilda meets. But then she meets Miss Honey, who is her class teacher. And Miss Honey is a lovely person, a very kind teacher, and she recognises how special Matilda is. She's very kind, she's warm, she's encouraging, she gives to support to her, and she helps to encourage her inner voice that she is a special girl, she can do it, she is smart. All of those messages that she wasn't getting at home, she was getting in the classroom, Miss Honey. And so it's a very, very positive, I suppose, role model for Matilda, the figure of Miss Honey. And this sort of theme of one person helping a child or one person that can make a difference in your life is a very strong theme in a lot of Roald Dahl's books. And this idea that it only takes one person to change your life, that it can only take maybe one kind voice can make the difference, because these kind words impact the inner voice of children. If they're hearing from their teachers, and I think sometimes we underestimate the influence that we can have on young minds. If they hear from our teachers, you know, I believe in you, you can do it. I know it's difficult, especially learning a new language, but don't give up, keep trying. Those words, you know, become part of their verbal stream, that they feel, well, you know, maybe I can do it. If my teacher believes in me, then, you know, maybe I can. And then that's helping to build up their confidence. So connected to this, oh, sorry. I almost disappeared. Sorry. Connected to this, I'd like to talk about the idea of resilience. Because if we think of this story of Matilda, where she's, you know, growing up in quite a difficult, in a difficult family, and yet she somehow doesn't give up and she keeps going. I'd like to ask you, what do you think of, and please feel free to write in the chat box. I'll give you a moment here. If I say this word to you, resilience, what do you think of? What comes to mind? There are any adjectives? So we said before, maybe the idea of not giving up. Somebody has written there to be strong, endurance, never give up, strong, determined, having mental strength. Yeah, determination. Lots of very, very important words. Being adaptable, being able to cope with difficulties, patience. Patience is a virtue, as they say. Okay, so lots of very interesting words. Patience again, adapting to new conditions, learning from your mistakes and keep going. Tolerance, very, very important word, tolerance as well. Yeah, so sort of all of these things here. This is just one very simple definition of resilience, which is sort of an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. And that comes from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. But all of the words that you've said are all very, very important when thinking about resilience. And I wanted to tell you the story of Matilda to connect to this theme of resilience, which is so important for the idea of having a strong inner voice. So even as a young child, Matilda had enough resilience to be able to stand up for herself. Very challenging situations happen to her, yet she doesn't give up. So all of the things you were saying before, she learns to understand that being unique is a good thing. So even if she's different, that doesn't matter. Actually, it could be, a strength. She teaches us that differences should be both appreciated and celebrated. And so if we were to talk a little bit more about resilience to understand kind of what are the characteristics, if you talk about a resilient child or an adult having resilience, what are we talking about? Well, some of the things that you mentioned already in the chat box are having problem solving skills. So finding solutions in difficult situations. The second is strong social connections. So not feeling that you're alone, but that you have, people that maybe you can count on, which could just be one person that you can count on. Survivor mentality, what you're saying, that you don't give up, you keep going. Emotional regulation, which is sort of managing those big emotions that especially children feel. Well, adults feel too, but we sometimes think of very big emotions with children because they have a little bit less life experience, don't they? And self-compassion, being kind to yourself. And so we're going to talk a little bit in a few minutes. We're going to talk about all of these things, how important they are, but how we can help children develop them in our classrooms. So I just want to go back to Roald Dahl, the writer of this book, Matilda, and sort of, talk about the fact, why did he write about this idea of resilience? Thinking that, he wrote many, many books for children, and this was kind of an outstanding theme in most of them. And so I'd just like to take a minute or two just to tell you something about his life, why the idea of resilience was so important to him. So as many of you know, Roald Dahl was a British writer, and he actually became a writer much later in life, probably around the age of 30. So he didn't kind of start, as a teenager writing, started later. It wasn't what he thought he would do. And then he obviously ended up doing it very, very well. This is his family. But he had a kind of a tragedy in his family when his son, who was just 4 months old, was involved in a car accident in New York. And it was very, very dangerous at that time, what happened to him, because they couldn't really cure him, and for a parent it's a very scary thing to go through, and so his child, who was very, very young, had 5 operations, and the doctors, they couldn't help him. His little child had brain damage, and they couldn't help him after all these operations. And so basically Roald Dahl tried, I suppose, to think outside the box and try to think, well, this is my son and I want to find a solution. And what he actually thought of doing was to contact a friend of his who was called Stanley Wade, who's in the picture here with Roald Dahl. And Stanley Wade wasn't a doctor, he was an engineer, a very skilled engineer whose passion was making toy airplanes. And you can imagine, if you can see from the picture, but incredible detail in very, very small toy airplanes. And with Roald Dahl together, and they also collaborated with the head surgeon of Ormond Street Hospital, they basically came up with a small valve, and it's in the picture here, which would drain the liquid from the brain, and it basically saved his son's life. And it's an incredible story, and I'm probably not doing it justice telling you this in 1 minute, but you can maybe read more about it if you're curious. But it's incredible because this apparatus that they made It's called the Wade Dal Till valve, the WDT valve, and it saved thousands and thousands of lives. And Roald Dahl insisted on never selling it for profit. And so it was quite incredible in that situation there, how, thought outside the box, you actually got an engineer involved rather than just going down the field of medicine. But then, that expression, it never rains but it pours. Unfortunately, just about 3 months later, Roald Dahl's wife was a Hollywood actress. He met her in the States. And just about 3 years, I think, after they had resolved this problem with their little son, she was expecting another baby. And unfortunately, through the pregnancy, she ended up getting 3 massive strokes, which was, again, a terrible blow to the family. She came out the other end. She was able to recover, but she had to learn to speak, to read, to write, to walk, to learn everything again. And you can imagine, after already being through everything with their son, that was a very difficult thing as a family to have to go through. And so it meant that as her baby girl was born, they were basically learning these fundamental skills together. And I don't know if any of you have read the Roald Dahl's book, The BFG, which is another classic, another wonderful book. But in the BFG is very famous because it has the big friendly giant has a special language called Gobblefunk, which children absolutely love. But this Gobblefunk was actually inspired by his wife. Because when she started to learn to speak again, she would mix up her words. And so when she wanted to say something like, "You drive me crazy," she would say, "You yake my doddles." And so all of these funny words would come out, and they would actually laugh a lot together about it. And he took inspiration from this tragedy, really, in his life with his wife, and he put it into the book of the BFG. And so I think, kind of learning a little bit more about Roald Dahl's life, you understand his books and why he emphasized so much this idea of having to be strong in the face of tragedy and difficult circumstances. And so going back to our classroom, how can we build resilient learners? So we know that different things can happen in life. But some ideas here, I think some quite important things. One is to practice coping strategies when calm. And I would probably emphasize when calm, because I think when somebody is already upset and anxious, I think sometimes the worst words we can say are sort of calm down, because very often when somebody gets to, a certain height of anxiety, it's actually very difficult to calm down because we're not always taught to do so. And so I think, when it's a very calm moment, when people are feeling stress-free, that's a good time to actually teach them, if you do get upset, these are things that you can do. Also practicing gratitude to gain perspective. And we'll be talking more about that later, because obviously it's very hard to be complaining and be negative if at the same time you're being thankful for the things that you have. Teaching and modeling flexible thinking skills. So thinking outside the box, what are other ways of doing things? Learning and growing from failures together. They're allowed to make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. Teaching and practicing positive self-talk. So like some of the examples we were saying before, I can do it. I believe in myself. And I think it's something very important that children learn to do for themselves, that they're not only dependent on an adult to give them those sort of positive words, because maybe they might have a wonderful primary school teacher. I'm sure, like one of you, if you're here on a Wednesday afternoon, you're already doing all of this, but maybe the next teacher they have won't give them that same positive feedback. And so I think it's important that they do learn to do it for themselves. Teaching and encouraging self-compassion, that they're kind to themselves, building confidence, checking in with their emotions. We'll be talking about that in a moment as well, on a regular basis. And also reframing struggles, that when something difficult happens, that they can also see that it's also perhaps an opportunity for growth. And Svetlana is writing, "I can do it, you can do it, we can do it." That's lovely. Thanks for that positivity, Svetlana. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more, just to give some ideas for the classroom as well, about emotional regulation. So one of the reasons why these big emotions, these big feelings can be so uncomfortable for small children is that sometimes they don't view the emotions as temporary. So if they're having a bad day, children can tend to exaggerate a little bit and kind of think, okay, everything is gone now. My life is ruined because this thing happened. And so sometimes they can lose perspective. And to be honest, probably sometimes as adults, we can lose perspective too. And so one of the things is to try to help children understand that, maybe you're feeling sad or upset now, but this is not a permanent feeling. It's not going to be like this forever. And I found a very nice way of doing this is connecting emotions with the weather. The fact that the weather isn't permanent and neither are your feelings. And if you're good at guessing accents, you've probably understood that I'm from Ireland. And so this is pretty much a day in Ireland. You can have sun, you can have wind, you can have clouds, you can have lightning, but the sky is constantly changing. And so I think that can be kind of reassuring for children. I think also sometimes it can be kind of hard to pinpoint a feeling and kind of say, what is the word, that really describes how I'm feeling right now. And so it can also be nice to, encourage children to use the weather to express their emotional states. And also understanding that we all experience the weather, but maybe it feels different to me than it feels to you, or it means something different to me than it means to you, and that's okay. So, it could be today my feelings forecast or my weather, keeping it simple, is stormy, and this means I'm feeling angry, or, it feels sunny and, this makes me feel happy. And there's, so many projects, so many things that we can do to work around this idea of feelings, connecting it to the weather. A very, very short exercise. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. If you've been to any of my talks before, you know that I'm very interested in mindfulness and trying to find moments of calm in the classroom, because I think classrooms can be very, very busy places, and especially primary classroom. And so this is a very simple but very nice exercise which children tend to enjoy very much, where they're given a picture of a rainbow, and this is a little craft they can make by themselves. Just to give you an idea, there's a picture here. So they place their finger at the bottom of the rainbow on the left, and they take a deep breath in. As they move their finger halfway up, and then when they get to the top, they leave their breath out, they exhale. So they're breathing in and breathing out. And as you can see, for the colors of the rainbow, it just means, maybe 4 or 5 deep breaths, which can be a moment of calm in a busy school day, which for many, many children is very, very welcome. And it's an exercise, I think maybe because there's the rainbow and the colors, children tend to enjoy very much. So just going on from this for a moment. So I suppose also thinking about being mindful and being calm, we have to also be mindful of how we're also interacting with our students. So, when little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm and not join their chaos. And sometimes I know that's easier said than done, but I think it's always us also as the first ones being mindful of our inner voice and our actions. Connected to this idea of emotions, we know that sometimes it's easier to express what we want to say in paint, in crayons, in design, in colour. And so I just wanted to give you 2 ideas for art projects. And obviously there's so many books as well. And later you'll be able to find this talk on YouTube if you want to maybe have a little look again. And we'll be including some books on emotions. I'm sure some of you have used The Colour Monster, In My Heart. There's the Dragon series about emotions. There's When the Crayons Went on Strike. There's so many nice books which connect colour and emotions. I think for young children, they're always a pleasure to work with. But one exercise here is also quite nice, using the work of Pablo Picasso. Of looking at the face and drawing different emotions that somebody might be feeling, or that sometimes you can feel more than more than one emotion all at once, and that's also okay, because as you said, the emotions can be changing. So this is just one idea for those of you who are like, you like doing art, and I know in the primary classroom art plays a major role as well. And I also quite like the idea of interpreting Andy Warhol. So here, obviously, the faces are similar, but also this one you could change to have each face maybe show a different emotion. I think they're kind of quite nice projects as well at the beginning of the year, when you're trying to get to know children as well, maybe also the shy ones who don't always come out and maybe take a little bit longer to come out of their shell, that they're kind of nice exercises to get them chatting. Because I think once a child draws a painting or paints a picture, they always want to tell you all about it. Okay, so just moving on, from this, I want to go back to this idea of self-talk, of chatter, of what we say to ourselves, the words that we use when we're talking to ourselves. Are they kind words? How are these words? So one of the things is that when we're kind of connecting with other people, very often we emphasize the highs and the lows. If you'll agree with me, I think very often, we don't really ring people and say, oh, it's a really normal day today. We love ringing people when we have fantastic news. And we say, I have to tell you, it's something wonderful has happened. But likewise, also when something awful has happened to us, we want to share, and we want to get that out, and we want to share with somebody. And I think this is why, isn't it? Sometimes we hear that, the importance of word of mouth, and you always hear restaurants saying, if you've had a bad experience, please tell us, because they know for every bad experience, we'll tell 35 people. And so very often the kind of communication we have can be very, very high energy. And when somebody comes to us, not just talking about children now, I mean, talking in general, sometimes without wanting to, we can kind of add fuel to the fire, if you're all familiar with that idiom. Because very often imagine a friend comes to us and they're upset, very often what they are focusing on is receiving empathy. They don't really want to have practical solutions. And we're coming from a very caring place with our friend, that we're trying to understand the situation. And so we can end up sort of asking lots of questions, who was this person, and what happened, and when did it happen, and where did it happen, and why did it happen? And so what we can end up doing is we ask the person to relive the experience that they've actually needed the support for. And what that means is it's kind of called co-rumination, where you both end up reliving this experience together, which is okay to a certain point. But we all know that, there are some people that you can go to support for that will listen, but then somehow will sort of guide you towards a solution. Or there are people that can maybe add fuel to the fire, which they'll actually make you even more upset and angry than when you first went there, because they're so annoyed that this has happened to you that the emotions get even bigger. And while at that time, we might actually quite enjoy that and kind of think, okay, well, I've really got that out of my system. Sometimes it does more harm than good. I don't know if any of you remember these pictures. Maybe I'm showing my age here. I must say that it's my sister. I'm not taking responsibility. My sister was a massive Star Trek fan. And so these were familiar faces in our house when I was growing up. But you know that they're called Kirk and Spock. And it's a sort of idea that Kirk was always very warm, lots of empathy, very kind, whereas Spock was very sort of cold, intellectual. And so sometimes what we need is somehow to find this balance between kind of the emotion and the cognition. So when we're supporting others, we need to offer for sure the warmth, the comfort of Kirk, but somehow also the intellect of Spock, that once people have been made feel validated and connected, that somehow we can try to help them take a step back and provide the big picture advice, which is, easier said than done, but it's certainly a reflection to make. Thinking about our young learners, but somebody's written in the chat box there that, this is very much also for middle school and teenagers. And I think when it comes to the mind, to psychology, I think, it's valid for everybody really to reflect a little bit on some of these things. But, sometimes with children, as we said, they can feel these big emotions, and we might hear things. And obviously I'm speaking to also as an examiner, as an interlocutor. So I've been in exam sessions with young kids, and, it's a nerve-wracking experience. But, sometimes you can hear kids saying things, oh, tests are scary and I can't speak English, or there's too much to study. Everyone is so much better than me. Nobody likes me. All of my other friends seem happy. What's wrong with me? And so they kind of put on these negative glasses where they kind of don't, they maybe lose perspective and don't see or highlight their own strengths. And we know, and I like this image very much, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. And so the power of your thinking. And this is kind of where, going back to the Kirk or the Spock, or adding fuel to the fire, where we listen to children, we validate them, but at the same time, we try to get them out of that and thinking in a different way. Another thing I'd like to share with you, I don't know if you've ever heard of the spotlight effect, is that sometimes we also end up having a lot of negative self-talk because we worry so much about what other people are thinking. We overestimate actually how much other people are thinking. But if you think of how much time you spend worrying and thinking about yourself, about past mistakes, about future worries, everybody else is the same. And I think that's incredibly reassuring, actually. We're all kind of in our own bubbles, worried and thinking about things with this chatter in our minds. There's an expression that it's been said, you worry less about what people think about you when you realize how seldom they actually do. But this spotlight effect was very, very short experiment where in a university, they gave T-shirts to students, like really, really embarrassing T-shirts, and said, okay, you have to walk around the campus in this T-shirt for the rest of your day. How many people do you think are going to kind of notice you, maybe laugh at you? They're like about 80%. And it actually turned out it was about 15. And it's a very interesting experiment. And I think somebody mentioned before also high school students. I think as students get older, they get more and more self-conscious. And so it's very interesting to talk about something like this with them. Helping our pupils gain perspective. This is another activity that I do very often at the start of the year with students, to try to promote this positive self-compassion, treating ourselves kindly, to try to build this resilience. It's a very simple exercise of children just drawing an outline of their hand. I believe I am. And then obviously the teacher helping them with some of these words, which depending on the age, obviously you're going to choose words that are suitable for their language level. But these are lovely displayed in the classroom as well, because I think with young children as well, when they have those moments of doubt, it's great to have it there that, you can bring them along and say, but look, let's have a look together. Remember, you are all of these things. Maybe you've forgotten it right now. Maybe the weather is dark right now, but this is you and this is who you are. And I think it's a really lovely exercise for children to do. And maybe it's something you could also try yourself. Other things, I suppose, are stories to inspire. I love stories. To have so many stories to share with you. But I love the story of Michael Jordan. It's another book. I don't know if you've heard of Salt in His Shoes, which is about the fact that Michael Jordan, who we know is an incredible basketball player, was actually very short for his age initially. And he used to get very fed up about wanting to play basketball with all of his friends, and they wouldn't include him because they thought, you're too short to play basketball. And it's a lovely story to share with children. But certainly the message here about not giving up from Michael Jordan, I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed. And I think that's a very, very beautiful, strong message for children to hear from an icon like him. So the last part of our talk, we're nearly at the end of our talk, is this idea when we have this inner voice that's sort of racing and maybe taking over the controls, how can we quieten it? Okay, and as I mentioned to you before, I am very interested in mindfulness, and going back through the YouTube channel that Sylvia mentioned, you know, there are talks on mindfulness that we have given. And so, you know, perhaps you might like to check those out. But in the meantime, some other ideas. Some of you might laugh if you've heard of Marie Kondo, who believes in sort of creating inner peace by throwing out a lot of your positions and just keeping the essentials. I think she's probably somebody people kind of love or hate. Or for sure you've heard of the tennis player Nadal. And actually, the two of them have something in common, which is called compensatory control, which is trying to create order in the physical environment to provide the order you seek internally. And so maybe some of you have seen Nadal before a tennis match, that he has this ritual of lining up all of his bottles and fixing his hair. And he does these things before he takes a shot to kind of give himself inner calm and to control his chatter. Another is reframing, which I think takes practice, of trying to change the narrative. So when something negative happens, of trying to view it from a different perspective. And I think that also goes back to what we're saying about the Kirk and Spock, of when somebody comes to you with a difficulty, of slowly maybe trying to say, well, how could we see this from another angle? Perhaps it's not quite as bad, because sometimes when you're in a situation, it feels like the end of the world. And then with students, a very nice activity is also to, you know, to ask them, you know, what went well today? At the end of a day, what went well today, or what went well this week, this month? 3 things. And, you know, not just maybe getting them to write down the 3 things, but getting them also to explore why the 3 things happened in a little bit more detail, so that they can explain and talk about it. You know, and this in itself reduces the anxiety by focusing on the positives. And there would be lots to say about gratitude. We know that cortisol is a stress hormone, and gratitude is one of the things that reduces it by 20%. As we said before, if we're talking about what we're grateful for, what we're thankful for, it's very hard to feel stressed in the same moment about things. And we know that gratitude boosts happiness. And so thinking about this for the classroom, there are lots of different exercises in gratitude, you know, questions that we can ask our kids. So maybe, what's a favorite gift that somebody gave you, or who did you thank today? What's your favorite thing about our school? What made you laugh or smile today? Little questions. Or a scavenger hunt is another nice idea. Find something outside you enjoy looking at. It could be the sun. Sometimes we're not grateful for that. We just take it for granted. Or find something you know someone else will enjoy. Find something that makes you happy. Find something that tastes good. And so these are all nice things to get them to recognize that these are all lovely things in their life that sometimes they don't maybe reflect enough on. Another is the gratitude jar. And as I said, I'm sure some of you are already doing this, where the students just on small slips of paper write down one thing that they're grateful for, and they fold it in the jar. And it's lovely because sometimes it's the really simple things that come out. So maybe it's a beautiful sunrise, or a smile from a friend, a stranger, maybe an encouraging word from a friend, from a teacher. And one I particularly like is actually the thankful chain, which is, rather than putting it in the jar, you kind of create a little chain. And this is something that, if you thought this could work in your classroom, it could be something to do maybe once a month, and then the chain just gets bigger and bigger, so you can decorate your classroom. It just gets bigger through the year. And again, it's something that I think children enjoy doing very much, and it's something visual to see all these things that we're grateful for. What feelings does this picture give you? I know on a rainy day here today, seeing the sunlight coming through the trees, for me, it gives me a sense of calm. I don't know for you, serenity, calmness, freedom. Yeah, calm is kind of an overwhelming, and I think we all need more calm in our lives, don't we? And this is the power of nature. I want to show you a very different picture now. And some of you may have seen these pictures before, but there are many studies done. These are called the Robert Taylor homes, and they were built in the 1970s in Chicago as an answer to kind of a housing crisis. They were later, in later years, torn down as they understood that it wasn't really the best solution for a housing crisis. But when people were assigned apartments in these blocks, they had no power over where their apartment would be. And it would be potluck on whether they would just look onto concrete or whether they would look onto a green space with trees. And psychologists in later years actually did some studies on the tenants in these apartments and found that people who growing up through their life had the opportunity to look onto green spaces and trees built much more resilience than those who were just looking onto a concrete wall. And, you know, we might say, well, that's probably obvious, but, you know, sometimes we forget maybe the power of nature and to get out there and go for a walk and enjoy the greenery. You know, because nature generates so many positive emotions, such as calm, as you all mentioned a moment ago, joy, creativity, which also facilitates concentration. I think nature walks for children is great, or also bringing nature into the classroom. Because I think one of the wonderful things is sometimes you don't have to also be physically in nature, but just even viewing nature scenes, that it increases our ability to pay attention. And this also helps with emotional regulation. So we're basically at the end, and I would like to finish. I hope you found some things to think about in your classroom, but I'd like to finish with some words of Roald Dahl, as we've kind of mentioned him through our session a little bit, talking about Matilda and the Big Friendly Giant. Very, very simple closing thoughts, simple but maybe important lessons from Roald Dahl. And these three messages kind of go through all of his books. And the first is never lose hope. The second is believe in yourself. And the last, also important, never stop learning. And obviously as teachers, we love that. And believe in magic as well. And that's pretty much it from me. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and welcome Sylvia back to us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chantelle, for this inspiring and heartwarming. I think all of us have read Matilda. It was a favorite story for a number of people, resonates so much with the power of teachers. I just wanted to, you know, you talked about self-regulation, and please, if you have questions for Chantelle, put them in the Q&A. There's a lot of thank yous here in the chat box. Thank you so much. I just wanted, self-regulation is a concept that it becomes very important within also the context of social and emotional learning. Yes. And I wanted, so how can a strong or a positive inner voice then link to self-regulation? How can we spend a little bit more time thinking about these two concepts together?
Yeah, for sure. I
mean, how does it affect it?
Yeah. I mean, self-regulation, as we know, is this idea in those sort of high stakes situations that you can manage your emotions, you can manage how you're feeling. And I think that's very, very connected to what's going on in your mind. I'll give you a very simple example, and Sylvia's heard me saying this before. Even though I've been training teachers for about 20 years, I still get very, very nervous before I have to give a webinar, because I'm aware this is your precious time, even more so in September. And so, you know, before talking to you, you know, one of the things that can come to your mind thinking of the self-chatter and what Sylvia's saying about self-regulation is to say, oh, I feel so nervous, oh, I hope it's going to okay. And you can really get yourself into a state of anxiety. And so sort of changing that self-talk. And so you're saying, you know, I'm not nervous, I'm excited about this. This is an opportunity to share. And so you're kind of talking yourself down. And so I think the words we tell ourselves are incredibly important, because that inner voice is with us every day. And I think it has a huge impact on the emotions then that you feel as a result of that. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. And can we think a little bit about the actual language? Because a lot of them, can we imagine the learners doing this in their mother tongue? How do we cultivate that inner voice now in the second language classroom? And then what is the space of the mother tongue within that project of, you know, cultivating the inner voice?
Well, I think the two of them go hand in hand. I mean, certainly for me, when we're talking about building children's confidence, I think what they say to themselves probably will come, because we're talking about the young learner classroom, will come more naturally in their mother tongue. So what they're going to say to themselves is their mother tongue. But I think we can bring that to the next step, where when they're starting to learn a language, that the language that they're learning is also positive affirmations from the teacher, so that when they're talking to themselves, they're talking in a second language, but that they're talking in a very positive way, a very positive sense. But I think first and foremost, it's about building a child's confidence. So not necessarily in English, but in their mother tongue. But then I think once that initial job has been done and the classroom becomes a safe space, then I think it's very easy to build on that also in a second language.
Very important. Thank you. And one other thing, you talked about this relation between colors and emotion, and you mentioned some of these titles there. I know we will place them again, and we will have the exact titles in the YouTube. But would you like us to suggest some readings that we would want to do now and throughout the year that have particularly inspired you from developing the topic?
Yeah, I think when it comes to colours, because I know I have such respect for primary school teachers, and I think there are a lot of primary school teachers here today, because kids do get bored so quickly, and I think you have to be so creative as a primary school teacher. And so I think connecting art with anything we're doing is very important. And so books like The Colour Monster, which I'm sure loads of you have used. Also, In My Heart is a particularly beautiful one, which I've seen interpreted into a play in a primary school, which is really, really lovely visually. Also, some of the other ones I was mentioned, one is, I don't know if you can see it here, but it's maybe not, but it's one, The Day the Crayons Quit, which is absolutely hilarious for young children because they're constantly using crayons. And so you get to hear, for example, the red crayon who's completely exhausted because it's always used for buses and for Santa Claus and for all these things, or maybe the brown crayon who thinks its life is a bit boring. It's a very, very funny book. But there's so many, I think, books which have been developed because I think the use of colors is really relatable for children.
Great, and we've got a question. Thank you so much, Chantelle. We've got a question from one of our participants here. Shalini, she asks, how can we deal with children who are generally lost in their own world and they try to escape from situations? So maybe they're just a little bit off somewhere.
Yeah, I think, it's every child is different. And I remember, being at university, one of the messages that I was told by my psychology professor was, you never know what a child is leaving in the morning, so always be kind. And so I think the first step is definitely that the child is kind and feels that they're coming into a safe space. But certainly some of the activities that I was mentioning before about mindfulness, the idea of mindfulness for children, of starting with very short exercises, is the idea of trying to bring them back to the present moment with very, very short. I mean, some exercises which are a lot of fun as well is actually to put on pop music, which you might think mindfulness has to all be quiet and serious. But sometimes what I do with kids is put on pop music and they have to run very, very, very fast to get their heart beating. And then they put their hand on their heart and they focus on their heartbeat slowing down after dancing or running to the pop music. And that's a very nice exercise. As well as ones of using the senses, of focusing on things they can hear, things they can see, things they can touch.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chantelle, for this inspiring presentation. It's always such a pleasure to have you with us. You're such a good storyteller as well. You put us in with the stories. And I think this was our first webinar of the series, Energize Your Classroom with a Human Touch. And I think you all got a good sense of what is this human touch that we envision here, and we want to keep discussing throughout this season, starting in September, but then going on towards till December. Our next time that we will meet for our Energize Your Classroom is on the 16th of October, and we will look there at the teenage classroom and thinking about soft skills for that particular age group. But also we have another series of webinars coming up on our products, assessment products, but also next week, we're starting with our Language Art for Teachers, particular series on different skills development. We hope that we will be able to see you again in one of our future webinars. A big thank you to Chantelle, and please do not forget to fill out the evaluation form. A big thank you to everyone.
And thank you to you, Sylvia. Thanks for all the lovely comments in the chat box. It means a lot. And thanks also to Language Surf for the opportunity. And if I may, it's also quite special, I think, for an examination board to focus on this part of humanity in the classroom. I find that very inspiring. So thank you for inviting me.
All right, everyone. See you in one of our next webinars. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye-bye.